This lesson is on colons and semicolons. Let's get started. All right, we begin as always with a brief lesson overview. We're going to talk about the difference between colons and semicolons. We're going to talk about the rules for using colons, the rules for using semicolons, and then finally, we're going to end with some practice. We're going to have some practice sentences, and you're going to decide where the colons and semicolons go. All right, to begin with, what is a colon and what is a semicolon? A colon is the two-dot mark. It looks like that, two periods, one on top of the other. It's generally used before lists of some kinds and in some types of citations in formal academic writing. A semicolon is the dot and comma mark, so it looks more like this. You've got something like a comma on the bottom, you've got something like a period or a dot on top, and it looks like that. It is generally used to join two independent clauses or within certain types of lists. Think of it as the mature older brother of the comma with more privileges, or think of it as a cross between a colon and a comma, which it kind of is. All right, so here are the rules for using colons in your writing. First, use a colon after a complete sentence to introduce a list of items when introductory words such as namely, for example, or that is, don't appear. So, I need 5 items from the store. That's a perfectly complete grammatical sentence. And since we're about to list the things you need, we put a colon and then we say milk, eggs, sugar, flour, and baking powder. Sounds like a yummy cake. Next, don't use a colon unless it follows a complete sentence or unless your style manual dictates it. Please go to the store and buy milk, eggs, sugar, flour, and baking powder. Now in this case, please go to the store and buy doesn't really work as a complete sentence, whereas I need 5 items from the store does work as a complete sentence. So when you're just going to go right into the list and you haven't got a complete sentence in front of it, then don't bother with the colon. All right, next rule. Capitalization and punctuation are optional when you are listing single words or phrases in bulleted form. You all used a bulleted list, I'm sure. If each bullet or numbered point is a complete sentence, punctuate it as such. Above all, be consistent. So, we're going to look at 2 different ways to say the same thing. There are 3 ways a cook can please me. A, plan menus. B, supervise a kitchen. C, fake a French accent. Now, in this case, each of these items in the list is a complete sentence. Plan menus, it's an imperative sentence. Supervise a kitchen, imperative sentence. Fake a French accent, imperative sentence. Has an implied subject, you, and it has a verb. It's a complete sentence. Now let's look at it the other way. There are 3 ways a cook can please me. Planning menus. Well, all of a sudden that's not an imperative anymore, so it's not a complete sentence. Supervising a kitchen, and faking a French accent. So we don't need to capitalize the P, the S, and the F as we did up here, because these are complete sentences, and these are not. And you'll notice you use the colon in both places. All right. Now, here's a place to use a colon instead of a semicolon. Use a colon instead of a semicolon between 2 sentences when the second sentence explains or illustrates the first and there's no coordinating conjunction between them. If only one sentence follows the colon, don't capitalize its first word. If more than one sentence follows the colon, capitalize the first word of each sentence following. So, let's look at an example. I enjoy playing music. Songs by the Beatles are my favorites. Now, in this case, I enjoy playing music and songs by the Beatles are my favorites are both complete sentences. But the second sentence about the Beatles clarifies or illustrates I enjoy playing music. But there's only one of it. Only one sentence following that colon, so we don't capitalize the S in songs. However, I enjoy playing music. Songs by the Beatles are my favorites. The Grateful Dead's songs are pretty good too. In this case, we have 2 sentences following the colon that amplify that first sentence. So we capitalize the first letter of each. We capitalize the S in songs and the T in the. All right, next, use a colon to introduce a direct quotation that's more than 3 lines long. You don't use quotation marks for this kind of quotation. Leave a blank line above and below the quoted material and single space the quotation, even if you're double spacing the rest of your document. and don't use quotation marks. This is most often used in academic writing. So here's our example. The poet Peter S. Beagle introduces his poem, The Pigeon and the Dog, with a touching but mysterious paragraph. So I'm writing about this poet and this poem, and I start by quoting his introduction. But because this is obviously more than 3 lines long, look at that, it's 7 lines long, I'm not going to put this in quotation marks. I'm going to set it in its own little paragraph, in its own little format, and I have the colon in front of it. So the introduction is, every word of this song is true. The dog's name was Schnapps. He was half German Shepherd, half boxer, and all kind-hearted fool. The pigeon was called Duck, don't ask, and she was the size of a football from eating Schnapps's kibble. It all happened in the Redwood Hills. So if I'm writing about the poem as a whole, I may start by quoting the poet's introduction. It's longer than 3 lines, so I set it in this special format, and I introduce it with a colon and no quotation marks. Next, use a colon to follow the salutation of a business letter, even when addressing someone by his or her first name. Never, ever, ever use a semicolon after a salutation. Just don't ever do it. You may use a comma after a salutation for personal correspondence, but if you are writing formally in a professional or business or academic context, use the colon. Dear Mr. Davis, to whom it may concern, and even Dear Fred. If you're writing to Fred because he's your business partner, use the colon. You want to sound like a grown-up. Next, here are some rules for semicolons. Use a semicolon in place of a period to separate 2 independent sentences where the conjunction between them has been left out. I am the captain of this ship, semicolon. Therefore, I expect you to swab the decks when I tell you to swab them. These 2 sentences are connected only by a semicolon. If you put a comma there, it would be a run-on sentence, and also you'd run out of air. So you use the semicolon to join them because there's no conjunction. Come back tomorrow, semicolon, it will be sunny. These are 2 perfectly functional independent sentences. Come back tomorrow, it will be sunny, so you join them with a semicolon. Next, it's best to use the semicolon before introductory words, such as namely, however, therefore, that is, i.e., e.g., for example, and for instance, when they introduce a complete sentence. Use a comma after the introductory word. Let's look at an example here. I grow many herbs in my garden, semicolon. For example, comma, I have basil, mint, rosemary, and lavender. So in this case, we have a complete sentence after the semicolon, so we need that semicolon there. For example, I have all of these herbs. All right, next, use either a semicolon or a comma before introductory words when they introduce a list following a complete sentence. So complete sentence followed by list with introductory words in the middle. You can have either a semicolon or a comma after those introductory words. Use a semicolon or a comma before those introductory words. Use a comma after the introduction. So, cotton fibers can be used to make many different fabrics. Complete sentence, semicolon. For example, comma, corduroy, denim, jersey, and muslin. Now, let's look at it the other way. Cotton fibers can be used to make many different fabrics. Comma, for example, comma, corduroy, denim, jersey, and muslin. Comma in both places, but you can use either a semicolon or a comma in those circumstances, in those right after fabrics. All right, next. Use the semicolon to separate units in a series or a list when one or more of the units contains commas. I have received postcards from Munich, Germany, Yokohama, Japan, Lima, Peru, and Sydney, Australia. In this case, because we're talking about cities within countries, we have a comma after the city and before the country. You have to do that. It's one of the rules of commas. So because we've got a comma inside an item on the list, we use semicolons to separate the items on the list. Otherwise, you're saying, I've gotten postcards from Munich and Germany and Yokohama and Japan. And people are going, wait a minute, Munich's in Germany, Yokohama's in Japan. Stop being all weird. Well, semicolons stop the shouting. I have received postcards from Munich, Germany, semicolon, that's one place. Yokohama, Japan, semicolon, that's another place. Lima, Peru, semicolon, that's another place. And Sydney, Australia, period, because it's the end of the sentence. Next, use a semicolon between 2 sentences joined by a coordinating conjunction when one or more commas appears in the first sentence. This is basically to avoid confusion. This is to say, I am making a bigger break than I did with those commas. Let's look at it. When I graduate from medical school, I will become a doctor, and I think I will be a good one. In this case, we use the semicolon to indicate that the pause there is more important than when I graduate from medical school. Because when I graduate from medical school can't be a sentence by itself. I will become a doctor can. So we're separating two complete sentences. When I graduate from medical school, I become a doctor, and I think I will be a good one. Two separate independent sentences. We join them with a semicolon, even though the coordinating conjunction and is here, because we don't want people mixing up this pause right here with this pause for the comma. Second example, if I can, I will visit you in the hospital, and if the nurses allow it, I will bring you flowers. If I can, comma, I will visit you in the hospital, semicolon, because then we have a coordinating conjunction and another independent sentence. And if the nurses allow it, comma, I will bring you flowers. All right, let's do a little practice here. See if you can figure out where in these sentences the colons and semicolons should go. First, pizza dough requires 4 essential ingredients: water, flour, salt, and yeast. Next, there are 4 members of the committee: Christopher, who is a police officer, Elaine, who is the mayor, Douglas, who runs the Chamber of Commerce, and Gina, who called the meeting. Next, you will need several items for the test, for example, a number 2 pencil, a paper, and a calculator. Next, this is my favorite book. It is about a dragon and a princess. Next, I have traveled to Nashville, Tennessee, Key West, Florida, and Seattle, Washington. And finally, the beginning of a letter, Dear President Smith. Take a good look. Make notes on a piece of paper. Pause the video if you have to. Ready? Here are your answers. Pizza dough requires 4 essential ingredients. It's the start of a list, so we use a colon. Water, flour, salt, and yeast. There are 4 members of the committee. Again, we're about to have a list, so we have a colon. Christopher, who is a police officer, semicolon. That's because Christopher, who is a police officer, is one member of the committee. That's one person. And we've got a comma right in the middle of that unit in the series, so we have to use semicolons to separate the units. Otherwise, people just get confused. Elaine, who is the mayor, semicolon. Douglas, who runs the Chamber of Commerce, and Gina, who called the meeting. And then you have a period there because it's the end of the sentence. You don't need another semicolon. Semicolons are not end punctuation. Next, you will need several items for the test. Semicolon. For example, remember that introductory phrase? Well, you use a semicolon before it. For example, a number 2 pencil, paper, and a calculator. Next, this is my favorite book, semicolon. It is about a dragon and a princess. We have 2 completely independent sentences here. This is my favorite book. It is about a dragon and a princess. Next, I have traveled to Nashville, Tennessee. Once again, we have items on a list that have commas inside them, so we have to separate the items with semicolons. Nashville, comma, Tennessee, semicolon, that's one place, the city of Nashville in the state of Tennessee. Key West, Florida, the city of Key West, or the island rather, in the state of Florida. And Seattle, Washington, the city of Seattle in the state of Washington. So we use semicolons to break up the items in the series. And finally, Dear President Smith. Chances are, if you're writing a letter to President anybody, it is a formal and at least somewhat businesslike letter, so you would end your salutation with a colon. And that's all for this lesson. Thank you for watching.